Last time we were taking a look at Michelangelo as a representation of the High Renaissance, and we're examining his sculptures. Today, I want to take a look at his painting, which generally he did not consider himself to be a painter. He considered painting to be beneath him. He felt that sculpture was three-dimensional, much more realistic. God works in three dimensions, and so he felt that that sculpture was a higher form of art, and so he felt that working in painting was not something that he was comfortable with, and not something that he really wanted to do. In fact, he had conversations with Leonardo, who was his contemporary. Leonardo felt that sculpture was the lower form of the arts because sculpture is messy. You constantly have to stand underneath water to keep the dust down, and then you're filled with dust, and it's noisy, and so he felt that that was inferior. But painting, you work with colors. God paints with colors, and so the true painter, should paint with colors. And so both of them had their favorite arts and felt that the other one was beneath them. Last time we were taking a look at Pope Julius II's tomb, which he commissioned Michelangelo to do, and Michelangelo went to the Pope to get reimbursement for the marble for it, and the Pope wouldn't see him, and so Michelangelo left, went back to Florence, and then the Pope finally said, "Hey, where's Michelangelo? Bring him back." And so he sends the Pope's army to Florence, and Michelangelo refuses to go. He's still upset that the Pope blew him off. And so he says, "I'm not going." And then the people of Florence saw the Pope's army getting closer and closer, and they pleaded with him, like, "Please, just go see what the Pope wants." And so finally Michelangelo goes back reluctantly, thinking that the Pope is going to have him finish the tomb. But instead, the Pope had something else in mind for him. Right? He really wanted him to focus on the painting, the ceiling to the Sistine Chapel. When Michelangelo goes to Rome, he says, "Hey, I would like you to paint the Sistine Chapel." And Michelangelo says, "I'm not a painter, I'm a sculptor." And so he felt that it was beneath him. He thought that he was being set up by another artist, Bramante, who was an architect and a rival of Michelangelo's in Rome. And Bramante had, he felt, a more favorable view with the Pope. And so he thought he was being set up, and so he grumbled the entire time. But it was a tricky challenge. If you notice, this is just the interior shot of the Sistine Chapel. You notice that there's a barrel vault, and so if you took a piece of paper and you bent it, it would have that kind of barrel look to it. So that barrel vault is going to be extremely challenging to apply Brunelleschi's one-point perspective to it, because the perspective is always going to be changing, and so Michelangelo has to figure out how to compensate for the barrel vaulting. Another problem with it was it's 70 feet high, and so it's a really long paintbrush to paint from the floor, and so Michelangelo knew that it's going to be tricky to paint all the way to the ceiling. He told the Pope that, and the Pope said, "Don't worry, Bramante has some designs for you. He has drilled some holes into the ceiling and extended ropes, and you can sit on the platform on the ropes." And then Michelangelo says, "Oh, that's just great. What do I do when I'm taking out the scaffolding? You're going to have holes in my ceiling. That's not going to work." And so Michelangelo didn't like that. So what he had to do is he had to develop his own elaborate scaffolding. And the other problem was the size of it. It's about roughly the size of half of a football field. And so it's a lot of paint that's going on there. So Michelangelo didn't want to do this for numerous reasons, but the main one was it was just going to take a long time, painstaking, and he didn't like working with the medium of fresco. And so, in fact, his contemporary, Leonardo, worked with a fresco. We'll take a look at the Last Supper, and it didn't work out well because Leonardo worked on more of an inferior technique, and it didn't really last very long. And so even in Leonardo's own lifetime, it started to peel away. But Michelangelo wanted things to be perfect, and so he wanted to do the longer, painstaking fresco, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But this is how Michelangelo feels. So these are his own words. He's complaining to someone. This is one of his writings, and this is what he says. He says, "I've already grown a goiter from this torture, hunched up here like a cat in Lombardy," right? That's up in France, "or anywhere else that stagnant water's poison," right? So this idea of, I hate being up here, stuck on the scaffolding. I feel like I'm just completely detached from humanity. My stomach squashed under my chin, my beard's pointing to heaven, my brain's crushed in a casket. So think about looking up all day long, how that's going to take a toll on the body. My breast twists like a harpy's. My brush above me all of the time dribbles paint, so my face makes a fine floor for droppings. And so the paint's constantly dropping on his face. And sometimes Michelangelo would just work for hours and hours on end, sometimes 24, 26 hours. He would just keep working. He just wanted to get done, and then he would finally collapse. And so his nights and days started to kind of blend together. He says, my hunches are grinding in my guts, my poor bottom, I kind of vid-angeled that, strains to work as a counterweight. Every gesture I make is blind and aimless. My skin hangs loosely below me, my spine's all knotted from folding over itself. I bent taut like a Syrian bow, and so it's kind of constant. His body is just twisted and contorted. Because I'm stuck like this, my thoughts are crazy, perfidious, tripe. Anyone shoots badly through this crooked blowpipe. My painting is dead. Defend me, O Giovanni. Protect my honor. I am not in the right place. I am not a painter. So he's writing to the Medici saying, please get me out of this. Get me out of this contract with the Pope. And the problem is, how do you turn down the Pope, right? So no one really wants to do that. And so he feels like he is stuck. I want to take a look at, just briefly here, Michelangelo's method. I'm going to show you a video of the technique that Michelangelo used with a fresco, which means fresh. It's just putting a thin layer of plaster down, then transferring your image onto that through charcoal, and then painting on top of the wet plaster. And then when the wet plaster dries, it hardens with the paint, and it becomes extremely stable.
It's known that his basic approach was a standard technique called buon fresco, which is still taught at places like this international conservation organization in Rome. The chief conservator is Paul Schwarzbahn, now with the Guggenheim Museum. He explains what has been learned from the restoration about Michelangelo's technique.
We're going to try and make a reproduction, if you will, to recreate the working technique of Michelangelo, the way he painted the frescoes of the Sistine ceiling. We're going to use the same materials, and we're going to try as best we can we're not Michelangelo, but to recreate his working technique. The materials that you see on the floor, we know from analysis, these are the materials that Michelangelo used to make his plaster.
The plaster is made from lime, water, and a brown volcanic ash called pozzolana. These are mixed into a smooth violet-colored paste. The plaster is applied to a surface prepared the day before called the oricio. This fresh, wet layer, the intonico, is applied just before painting.
The word fresco in Italian means fresh. And what it means is that we're painting on the fresh plaster. The painter was obliged to work before the plaster dried. Now, this means that the plaster could only be applied little by little as the painter worked in terms of what he thought he might finish in a day or before lunch or what have you. There's a word in Italian which is called the giornata. We know from the cleaning of the Sistina that colors are very, very bright, and Michelangelo wanted these bright colors. To do that, we see that in certain areas he put on, at the very end, just before he painted, a very bright white, more white, let's say, very, very, very thin layer of preparation, but very rich in lime. Very thin. It would be a millimeter or two thick, what he's putting on now. Like a sheet of paper.
After the plaster is applied, the design is transferred using cartoons, drawings on paper. The contours of the figure are incised into the wet plaster, sometimes using a piece of wood. A different technique is used to outline the details around the face.
The other technique is called spolvero in Italian, and probably called a pouncing technique in English. We make a series of small holes along the lines in certain very key points. Michelangelo, we see, did the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the ears, the throat, and then takes a little sack of charcoal or some powdered pigment. And then you'll see the pigment goes through the holes and leaves the design on the fresco. So he has something to use as a guide for painting. Okay, let's take it off. You see, that would be how Michelangelo transferred his design. And with that, it gives you a base for painting.
Michelangelo mixed ground pigments with water. He used just 7 colors derived from minerals found in earthen clays. For his greens, he used green earth, ochres for his yellows and reds, and cobalt or lapis lazuli for the blues. When Michelangelo applied the colors to the wall, they had a translucent quality, like watercolor. But as the plaster dried, a process called carbonation took place. Carbon dioxide in the air combined with the lime in the plaster to form a hardened rock-like surface of calcium carbonate. As a result of this process, the pigment particles were cemented in place, becoming a part of the wall.
The standard fresco technique is a rather stable technique. When it's done well, it lasts thousands of years. We have Roman frescoes that are close to 2,000 years old.
But did Michelangelo vary the standard technique in any way, embellish it perhaps by adding any other layers of paint or glue varnish to the surface of the fresco? Unfortunately, there is no complete record of Michelangelo's working technique. In letters to his family, he did write about painting the chapel, but he mostly complained of the uncomfortable working conditions. In front, my skin grows loose and long. My head is bent back on my shoulders, and my paintbrush drips a rich mosaic onto my face.
Poor Michelangelo. But what we have here, what's kind of ironic about Michelangelo, is that he mainly considers himself to be a sculptor, but mainly he's known for his painting, which is kind of one of life's ironies. But this is his design for compensating for the barrel vaulting and trying to create something that's going to be memorable in an important place like the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel is where they choose who the next pope is going to be. So when the pope dies, they all meet inside this room. They're locked inside this room, all the cardinals. And then they have a vote, and if there is a majority, they then burn some type of gas that comes out. That there is, if it comes out white, they've chosen a pope. If it comes out black, then they had a vote, but it wasn't conclusive, and so they're still deliberating. And so it's an important, very important room. I wanted to just take a look at just the design just briefly. If you take a look at the very center, he just divides it up into different regions. So that's how he's able to compensate for the linear perspective. At the very beginning, what we see is the creation of humanity all the way to the fall and the flood. And so at the very beginning, starting from the left-hand side, you see that God separating the light from the darkness, the creation of the planets, the separation of water, the creation of Adam, the creation of Eve, the expulsion from Eden. Then you have Noah building an altar to sacrifice. You have the flood, and then you have the drunkenness of Noah, right? And so mainly as we think about this, he's telling a story, and the question is, what story is he telling? What's at the very center of this particular work is humanity, right? Humanity is at the very center. So he kind of divides it up into 3, right? So you have pre-humanity with separation of light, the creation of planets and the water. Then you have Adam, Eve, and the expulsion at this center, the 3 center, and then the other 3 over here. This is about Noah, right? So it's a way of just kind of dividing up the story. But if you think about it, the narrative that it's saying is that humanity is at the center of God's creation, very similar to what we see with Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man, where he talks about the great artisan who places humanity at the center of creation to survey the surroundings, to choose to be whatever we want to be. Unfortunately, as we go throughout humanity, we tend to fall. We tend to get expelled from God's presence. The flood represents another era of sin within humanity. And the drunkenness of Noah suggests that, we tend to be fallible. And so what he's trying to do is he's trying to instruct that, yes, humanity is fallible. Yes, sometimes we do make mistakes, but we need to center our focus. We need to be grounded, right? And then on the surrounding the center images, these are all Old Testament prophets that prophesied of Jesus's birth or have something to do with Jesus. This is the painting of David slaying Goliath, very different from what we see with his sculpture in Florence. Here we see David on top of Goliath, who has been stunned by the stone, fallen, and then David picks up the sword and grabs the hair of Goliath and getting ready to lop off his head. Jesus comes from the house of David. If Israel was free from Rome at Jesus' birth, Jesus would have been the rightful king. And so not only was he the spiritual king, he was also the literal king of Israel. And so this demonstrates that importance of Jesus as king. Zechariah was an Old Testament prophet that defends Jerusalem, and his king he argues that the king will triumphantly enter into the city to bring peace to all nations. And he says in chapter 9, verse 9, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly, and riding upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass." And so this is prophesying of Christ's triumphant entry into Jerusalem, right? So Zechariah prophesied of the second coming of Jesus, and the dead will be resurrected and all the saints. And so he's prophesying of the future. Isaiah prophesies a lot about Christ, right? Prophesied about Jesus, suggesting that he is going to be the government, will be on his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. And so these are all people directing us to Jesus. Even though humanity is fallible that we see at the center, there is direction to elevate our thoughts to the divine, right? This one is Daniel, who's known for his wisdom and his righteousness. He says that God provides and God saves, right? So this idea of salvation. Jonah is swallowed by a fish. This one looks rather small in the context of swallowing a person, but giving that sense, right? So he's swallowed by a whale or a fish, and on the third day he was released as a sign of Jesus' death and resurrection. So another indicator of that on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And then we have Jeremiah, who prophesies of the death of Christ. He's going to be the lamb of sacrifice, and he also prophesies of the Eucharist, or we call it the sacrament. He says that Christ will be born king and a descendant of David. In chapter 30, verse 9, he says, "But they shall serve their God, their Lord, their God, and David, their king, whom I will raise up unto them." Right. So, and he also prophesies of the massacre of the innocents or the infants. When Christ was born, there was a decree to kill all infants under the age of 2, and so he's also prophesies of that moment. Ezekiel refers to a person coming from the house of David as the servant of God, a unique shepherd of Israel who will rule over the house of Judah, right? It says, "I will save them out of their dwelling places wherein they have sinned, and will cleanse them. They shall be my people, and I will be their God." And so even though we're surrounded by the fall of humanity and the drunkenness of Noah and the flood, there is a way to save humanity, right? That's kind of the direction, again, directing our attention. Joel talks about life, death, and the resurrection of Jesus. And he says it as though it's already happened, right? So it's kind of as though it's kind of past tense, even though he's looking towards it, right? So again, here he has his writings, he's looking about, he's teaching, he's instructing people towards Christ. And he says that Jesus took upon himself the plague, not of locusts, but of sin, right? So this idea of releasing us from them. And then there's also some women, sibyls, that are also represented. These are specifically priestesses who rule over the Greek colony called Cumaea, and they were mainly prophesying. They had oracles that were to be revealed, right? So the idea is that they too are looking towards the future and directing towards a better day, right? So just quickly going through, I already talked about this a little bit when we examined the entirety of the image, but this is the separation of light and dark. Some people argue that Michelangelo started with the drunkenness and moved towards this one. This one would have been one of his last images. And what they argue is that Michelangelo was so sick of painting this that his figures get larger and larger. If you move from the right to the left, the figures get larger and larger, meaning that they're just taking up more space. So he has less kind of details to work on. So it makes him be able to work a lot more quickly. And so maybe that's true. I think there might be something to that, but you decide for yourself. But what I like about this is God is represented kind of as an artist, right? Wearing kind of an artist smock, using his hands to go in there. It's not just the Word, right? In John it says, in the beginning was the Word, but here he's out there working, toiling with his hands as though he is an artist. And so again, we have the elevation of the life of the artist being someone like unto God who creates, right? So there's that connection with the artist and creation. Here's the creation of the sun, moon, and the planets, kind of God swooping in, surrounded by these kind of angels, and then moving towards, kind of directing towards the creation. Again, using his hands. This one, they kind of, some people kind of wonder if Michelangelo was a little bit tired of Julius II, who was constantly saying, when's this going to be done? When's it going to be done? When's it going to be done? And Michelangelo would finally say, it's going to be done when it's going to be done. And then Julius said, how about I throw you off the scaffold? And then Michelangelo kind of back off and remember his place. But this one, they kind of say, you know what? This is the only known representation of God's butt that is in art history. And so they suggest that might be a subtle nod where Michelangelo was a little bit more miffed with the Pope. So he just said, I'm going to put that in there, and what are you going to do about it, right? Here's the gathering of the waters, again, using his hands, directing. And then, of course, at the very center, we have the creation of Adam, right? Which is at the very center of the image, which is at the center of creation, which for the Renaissance is at the center of their studies, right? The Studia Humanitatis is all about studying people because we are an important species. We deserve to be able to have this room to be able to study ourselves. And so we see these ideas cultivating. We also see the ideas of Plato being represented here as Michelangelo was coming from the house of the Medicis, being raised as one of their sons. He was surrounded by these ancient manuscripts and becoming familiar with the ideas of Plato. And so here we have a deviation from the original narrative from Genesis where God created Adam out of the dust. Here, Adam is actually created having form and choosing to reach towards God and having that eternal kind of ambition, that eternal yearning to connect. And here we have God looking, reaching, directing towards humanity as well, having that kind of divine link that there is this closeness if we choose to be, right? If we choose to be close, we can be close. Too often we choose to kind of go against God, such as he's going to take a look at with the fall. Which in the church we kind of look at that a little bit differently, or the drunkenness of Noah, where we see that the flood, we see some complexities of human choices. What we see here is the emphasis on humanity at the core. We desire to have that eternal connection. Notice how he kind of flips their image. They kind of look like inverse images of one another, kind of having similar gestures of the knee, similar kind of extension of the other leg, kind of having the same gesture of the hand, even though Michelangelo's Adam here is just not, the hand is a little bit more kind of dangling there because he doesn't quite have the gift of life yet. But the face looks very similar. The forehead looks almost identical. The nose looks almost identical. And so here he's representing that that God created humanity in his own image, right? Both male and female. And so this is the creation of Eve, where it says in Genesis 2 that God took a rib from Adam and made a woman. And so this is her stepping kind of out of a cave or out of this kind of crevice here with this tree stump, and Adam's just kind of unconscious and kind of stepping forth from Adam. And even as she steps forth from Adam, she has that hand gesture, not that she's swimming, kind of could be a swimming stroke, but that she's praying towards God, and God's kind of they are kind of directing, saying, calling her out from the rib and giving her that gift of life. And so again, this similar kind of gestures within the hand structure that connects God and humanity. And in the very next panel, you have the temptation with the serpent around the tree, giving the fruit to Eve, and then Eve and Adam partaking of that, and then the angel expelling them out of the garden, kicking them out, and then you see them kind of hiding their faces. You see their faces in the shadows, kind of moving away, kind of in shame, recoiling from the choices that they made. I mean, the Catholics and a lot of other Christian denominations see this as a very negative consequence, right? A very negative idea of sinning away from God. God gave a specific commandment, and humanity chose to move away from God. And so they see this moment as a very negative, shameful, sinful way, because this is introduced sin, it introduces death, and it causes the need for Christ. Now, we see it quite differently. We see it as this is part of the plan, but part of the necessity of Christ. Part of the idea is us stepping away from God to be able to have the opportunity to make choices and to learn from our successes and failures. We kind of see this as more of a positive experience, but the Catholic Church and a lot of other denominations see it much more negatively. We can see that influenced by Masaccio's the expulsion, where we see the same ideas. You can see that Michelangelo was aware of this piece. He was familiar with it, and he kind of represents, he kind of pays homage to it within this. And then the next is the sacrifice of Noah. It's a little bit out of sync in terms of the story of Genesis, right? Because the flood happens before this. But Michelangelo kind of, just for the sake of putting four figures, there's a smaller block, and then there's a larger one. A smaller one's always followed by a larger one, right? That's just how he kind of divided it up. And so he wanted to make sure that this was a little bit larger, and so he puts them a little bit out of sync. This is the flood where humanity has made sins against God, so much so that he needed to destroy humanity, but he wanted to save a handful of people to repopulate. And so this again demonstrates the folly of humanity. And then after they get to dry land, after they make the sacrifice, Noah drinks too much, and then he is without clothes, and so his children see him like this. They don't want to, they want to cover him up, but they don't want to, look, and so they kind of walk in backwards to cover Noah. But what we see within the overall scheme of things, right, is a message. He wanted to convey ideas. He wanted to convey the thoughts of the High Renaissance. And so what I want you to think about is, how does this fit within the ideas that we've been discussing in terms of the Renaissance? How does it fit with the ideas of harmony, balance, symmetry? How does it fit with mathematical precision? How does it fit with the ideas of humanism, the Studia Humanitatis? How does it fit with Neoplatonism? How is he expressing the ideas that surround him, and how does that influence his representations that he depicts within the Sistine Chapel? This is a key piece because it's so important, central in the Vatican, right, where the center of Christianity is. He places this message there for people to go in and to see. It's interesting, though, because this was pretty scandalous when it was first created. People thought that having a nude Adam and a nude Eve and even a nude Noah in the work was a little bit too much for something so holy as the Sistine Chapel inside the Vatican. And so they thought that it might be perhaps pornography, or perhaps something, that's a little too scandalous or risque. But Michelangelo suggests, what? The creation is. This is the creation, right? This is what life is. This is what the story is as represented in the Old Testament. I'm just representing images of what they are so that we can visually see them, so we can visually digest them. And we have to remember, a lot of people were illiterate, right? We have the invention of the printing press coming around, but still that's going to take some time for the majority of the population to start to become educated. So people relied heavily on the visual arts to be able to represent the stories, for them to be able to see them and understand them within the mind's eye. And so he becomes a central piece to be able to represent the image of these stories and be able to demonstrate to people the importance of following God's commandments and some of the consequences that happen with sin. And so we see that duality within this particular representation. We see both the benefits of following God and also the consequences of defying or falling away.